the truth is the majority of the data on leaflet modification has focused on coronary obstruction risk, just because it is such a devastating complication.
Hello, everybody. Andrei Pop here. I am happy to welcome today Toby Rogers, who is truly one of the luminaries in the field of electrosurgery. He is with MedStar in Washington, D.C., and he's their lead for clinical investigations, also affiliated with Georgetown. He proctored our first Basilica and our first transcaval, and I'm forever grateful to him for that. So, Toby, welcome to Murmur.
Thank you. That seems like quite a long time ago already, those first cases.
Yeah, time flies when you're having fun. So where is the field going? There seems like leaflet modification is everywhere these days. Obviously, Shortcut is out. I suspect Telltale is not far behind. People are doing a lot of unicorns, llama corns, all sort of corns. And there are companies talking about leaflet extraction. Where are we going with this?
So I think that's a great summary actually, and we could almost finish the recording right now. But just to dive a little bit deeper, the very first leaflet modification procedure was over a decade ago now, and that was actually on the mitral. It was a LAMPoon, and then aortic leaflet modification followed soon after in 2017 with Basilica. So these procedures have been around for a while and dominated by electrosurgery using off-label guide wires and catheters. And that's been both an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is obviously that you can start doing these procedures immediately. There's no delay waiting on device development and regulatory and et cetera, et cetera. And so it has truly enabled many, many patients who would otherwise be denied TAVR or transcatheter mitral valve replacement or other things, therapy to access therapy because it's prevented complications that would otherwise have prevented them from getting treated. But it's also been a challenge because so long as the tools that we use to perform the procedures are off-label, that makes it more challenging from a teaching perspective, from a proctoring, and just from dissemination. So it's actually really encouraging that we're now at a stage where we have, one device that's commercially approved in the US, the Shortcut. I'm very hopeful that, potentially by the end of this year, we'll have a second device approved by FDA, which is the Telltale. And as you said, there are, I learned just today of another device from Europe for leaflet excision that is, in very early stages. So finally, it feels like there is a sort of groundswell, a momentum to make these procedures more mainstream, make them more accessible, and enable more patients to benefit from these truly, I think, transformational procedures.
I think that's a great summary. In my practice, I just looked back at all the cases that we've done, and we've been still quite conservative in terms of only doing this for patients who we deem to be not surgical or at high risk for surgery. Is that what you're doing, or do you think that changing in the near future with the off-the-shelf devices?
I think that it's always important to remember the indications within which we work, and the majority of leaflet modification procedures are performed for valve-in-valve. Again, the majority until now have been TAV inside a SAV, inside a surgical valve, although the number of cases of redo-TAV is growing, and so we're seeing more leaflet modification in that setting as well. But valve-in-valve, TAV-in-SAV, is approved for high-risk patients. So, almost regardless of the leaflet modification, these patients really should only be having reduced TAV-in-SAV if they're high risk for surgery. Otherwise, the actual TAVR procedure is technically off-label. But as we all know, it's not as simple as like, a line in the sand and you're either on one side or the other. And that entire evaluation of what is a patient's risk is far more complex and nuanced and multidisciplinary than that. And I think that it is accurate to say that these are, when you add a leaflet modification to a procedure, you are adding some complexity and therefore some risk to the procedure. And so if you're going to do that and offer that to a lower risk patient, there has to be a justification and a thought process and good informed consent and a heart team that is in agreement that is the right thing for the patient. So have I offered and have I heard of leaflet modification procedures being performed in patients who are lower surgical risk? Sure, but there's usually a very good clinical reason why that's being done. If you're truly low risk for surgery and you're at risk for coronary obstruction, then the truth is, in most cases, you should be having surgery. And at least until we have better evidence.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think my concern is that from a lifetime management perspective, we're seeing patients being offered an initial valve, being TAVR, being SAVR, whatever, and being told, in a few years, you'll be able to have another valve-in-valve. And, either the anatomy is not conducive to that, or the anatomy would only be conducive to that with leaflet modification. And I really feel that discussion needs to happen at the time zero based on the technology that we have right now, because, I shouldn't be promising patients that I'll be able to put a valve in if I don't know that I'll be able to put a valve in the future.
I agree with you, but I think we even just in the last few years, we've had access to new tools, both in terms of sort of relatively simple simulation tools like being able to implant a virtual valve on 3Mensio, for example, to the more advanced simulation like DASI simulations or FEops. And the truth is, I think if you have a young patient in front of you, then taking that extra step before the first TAVR to simulate what a valve will look like in their anatomy is actually incredibly enlightening and can enable you to then have a much more individualized discussion with that patient about what is their lifetime management going to be. Some patients you simulate and it doesn't really matter what type of valve you put in there, and there's just tons of room in the root, and you can confidently tell them that redo-TAVR should be straightforward in the future. Other patients with a smaller root, lower coronaries, whatever, you can pretty confidently tell them that their next procedure is going to be complex and potentially a surgical explant based on today's understanding and today's technology. And therefore, that patient may choose, well, actually, that is the extra piece of information I needed to really make the decision to do surgery as the first intervention. And so I find increasingly that that sort of simulation prior to the first procedure is something that is valuable. Patients find valuable, and like I said, you can do it fairly simply using the tools you probably have already access to yourself in the cath lab, or there are these more sophisticated imaging tools that you can send out for nowadays.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and we certainly do that. And I know that a lot of, let's say, higher functioning centers do that. But I am worried that around the country, a lot of people don't even look at the CAT scans themselves. They go by whatever the company puts in front of them. And I am worried that that doesn't happen. Simulated valves don't get put in, and even for TAVR. And in a lot of cases, surgical valves get implanted without much thought of what's going to come down the road.
Yeah. Yes. So short answer is yes, you're right. There is really no reason why it couldn't be part of the 3Mensio analysis that the industry partners provide. wouldn't be difficult to add that, I don't think, a virtual valve simulation with some VTC measurements, for example, just to give people an idea. But you're right that it's also not just a problem of TAVR. There is, although it's always talked about more than it's performed, root enlargement surgery is discussed a lot at conferences. And one of the downsides of root enlargements just approaches in surgery is that surgeons will sort of really cram the biggest valve they can in there, often with a little bit of a tilt. And that can actually, although it seems like a good idea because you're getting a bigger valve in, it can make the next procedure considerably more challenging because you either have a leaflet or even a post that's in an unfavorable location. So it's that whole butterfly effect, right? Even a small decision now can have a massive impact down the road that we don't even think about.
Well, and on that note, I think I have to applaud the Michigan team because Bo Yang actually has published data on what the root looks like before his surgery and what the root looks like after his surgery, and how easy it is to do that, to do valve-in-valve TAVR afterwards. And I think we need a ton more of that data, and we certainly need a lot more root enlargement, hopefully.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I think that you know I still see patients coming back with very small surgical valves. Um, and yes, we can fracture, and yes, we can do leaflet modification, but there's no question that um, whether it's transcatheter or whether it's surgery, the first intervention in a patient who's expected to outlive a tissue valve is really setting the scene for the subsequent interventions and the success and the durability of those subsequent interventions.
Yeah, and I think you said something else earlier. Small roots, I think, are particularly challenging. And I do think that there is some degree of misunderstanding in a community where people say, oh, yeah, I put a 19 Inspiris in and it's okay. The next day, when they come to put a TAVR in, they can make it 20 or make it bigger. But the reality is that it's not the valve that's restricting us. It's what's happening around the coronary height and the valve to coronary distance and all that kind of stuff. So I think definitely we have to work more with our surgical colleagues to get the message out there.
Yeah, I mean
Um,
it emphasizes why the heart team is still relevant today, even though, we don't obsess over necessarily what is the risk of the patient, and it's not the risk that's necessarily making the decision for TAVR versus SAVR. It's these more subtle and just as important, potentially even more important considerations now about anatomy, whether you can get a good result with one procedure or the other, what and how that sets up subsequent interventions.
so let me ask you guys, you're looking at the valve-in-valve app, TAV-in-TAV app, and they give you these red, yellow, and green, right? Valve to coronary distance is less than 2 millimeters. It's red. 2 to 4 millimeters is yellow, and more than 4 millimeters is green. Um, I personally struggle with these measurements. The images are pixelated. Do you measure to where is the coronary ostium? Is it the ampulla where it starts narrowing towards the left main, or is it the actual ostium? Um, how sanguine should we be with these measurements, and how do you look at these measurements yourself?
So I think we have to be honest and we have to first go back a little bit and see where those numbers came from. The 4 millimeter cutoff came from the Vivid registry data, which was TAV inside surgical valves. Um, I think that it's probably on the conservative side, even for TAV-in-SAV, but it certainly has not been validated as the appropriate threshold for redo-TAVR. I think for various reasons, it's quite possible that with redo-TAVR, we can tolerate considerably lower numbers. For example, TAVRs have a metal cage, and that metal cage prevents a leaflet from prolapsing outwards beyond the metal cage. And so, um, but we have not got any good validation data since to really test those thresholds. So I think in clinical practice, it's appropriate to use them still. I wouldn't advocate people, necessarily changing those cutoffs, because at the end of the day, um, the the data on outcomes after coronary obstruction are abysmal, pretty much 50-50 chance of making it alive out of the cath lab. And so pushing the boundaries in an arbitrary way and risking an event that can, with a 50-50 chance mortality risk is not something we should be doing. And I've always personally erred on the side when there's a case that's a bit borderline, either because the CT is difficult to read or you're not sure whether you're going to need to do balloon valve fracture and really push the valve closer, or when, like you describe, it's not entirely sure where to measure the ostium of the coronary, and depending on where you put your dot, you're either inside or outside the threshold. I've always felt in that scenario that I would err on the side of doing a leaflet modification, because I'd rather do an unnecessary leaflet modification than try and rescue a patient with an occluded coronary. So I think I share your concerns or your critique of those thresholds, but in the absence of anything else, I wouldn't recommend changing them. The other thing that I would just say is that none of us measure the functional significance of a left main stenosis based on a single diameter, right? We use area as a and yet here we are measuring predicting perfusion to a coronary based on a single diameter measurement from the frame of a valve to some arbitrary dot in the ostium. I'm sure we can be more sophisticated than that. Some of the more advanced simulation tools, I think, get us closer to those, more meaningful measurements. But at the end of the day, using the tools that we all have in our cath lab, it doesn't even have to be through Mensio, just a simple CT manipulation system that is in every single PACT system in every single hospital. It is possible to measure a distance very easily. And so, they remain useful tools for a quick check when you're screening a patient. And I think there's a reason why that's still the mainstay of assessment of coronary obstruction.
No, I think that's very reasonable, and it sounds to me like you err on the side of doing the leaflet modification if in doubt, and I think that's kind of how we practice. I think in many cases, especially for TAV-in-SAV, if you land the valve just a few millimeters below the STJ, the coronary sinuses will the sinuses of Valsalva will perfuse. But in that situation, I still think that leaflet modification plays a role because it makes the difference between being able to ever again access the coronaries versus not accessing the coronaries. So I do think that there's a little bit of, I would say, welcome indication creep, and I think that that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, everything we've talked about until now, and the truth is the majority of the data on leaflet modification has focused on coronary obstruction risk, just because it is such a devastating complication. But if we can get to a point that leaflet modification is a quick, simple, safe, reliable, all those words, adjunct to a TAVR, then there are potential other advantages, coronary access being one of them. If it facilitates getting a catheter through into a sinus of an otherwise inaccessible coronary, that seems like a positive thing. There is some data from both the original Basilica study and some benchtop studies that leaflet modification improves washout of the neosinus of the transcatheter valve. That may have benefit in terms of preventing leaflet thrombosis and HALT and valve degeneration in the future. I think that's, that's still hypothesis generating data at the moment, but I always come back to the surgical principles. No surgeon in their right mind would do a SAVR and leave the original leaflets behind. And if in an ideal world, I think that we would probably modify, if not remove, the leaflets of a diseased aortic valve before we put a TAVR in as well. We're obviously not there yet, but could I see in the future where routine leaflet modification in front of the left coronary, in front of the right coronary may be a thing. I think it's conceivable.
No, great. Talking about safety, do you routinely cerebrally embolic protect these people? Obviously, the data in general is terrible. What do you do?
So the short answer is it's evolved over time. Conceptually, the more you manipulate a degenerated valve, the more risk there is of debris embolization. However, I would also say conceptually, the more calcified aortic valve, conceptually a bicuspid valve, conceptually a valve-in-valve would all be, higher risk for debris embolization, and none of those subgroup analyses so far have borne out in any of the large studies of cerebral embolic protection as predictors of stroke, or predictors of benefit of cerebral embolic protection. So, I personally used it whenever I could for many years, but based on those data sets, I've stopped using it now actually. So I'm not using it routinely for Basilica now. The best data we have on Basilica, large scale data, is from the international registry that we published a few years ago. In that data set, there was no sort of mandated cerebral embolic protection, and when we, as a post hoc, looked at the difference in stroke rate, there was a numerical difference, but it didn't reach statistical significance. So the jury's out. I think that it really is just a judgment call on behalf of the operator. I can't point to any convincing data one way or the other. But on the whole, I've personally leaned towards, that really there just isn't data that at least the cerebral embolic protection device that we have access to now, the Sentinel, prevents stroke or prevents stroke with leaflet modification. So I've not been routinely using it. What about you?
It's interesting. We've done half and half, and we haven't seen a difference in our data. The other thing that's interesting for us is we've done a couple of cases transcarotid, and we obviously, when you're going transcarotid, you cannot protect, and those have worked very well. Some people, Keith Allen would argue that carotid access is protection in itself, and I think there's probably some truth to that. And on that happy note, I do think that transcarotid is actually a very elegant way to do leaflet modification. I don't know that it would be a thing that I would go for right away, but if you're looking for an alternate access site, it's so direct and so easy, and it takes so much redundancy out of the system that it's worked very well in our experience.
Yeah, I think again, there's the vast majority of leaflet modification procedures and all the teachings and techniques and things have always been transfemoral, just because that's the way most TAVRs are done. When a question I have had over the years, not uncommonly, is someone says, well, I don't use the contralateral femoral artery for my pigtail. Can I use the radial for the second, for example, the LV, the snare catheter for a Basilica? And I've always advised people not to do that, only because when you pull up, if you happen to pull too hard, too fast, you'd end up with a flying V, spanning the head and neck vessels, which seems like an undesirable thing, and therefore risk of cutting. Whereas if they're both from the femoral and you pull too hard, they just come around the arch, without
Right.
cutting any undesirable structure. So on the whole, I don't favor using, radial, whatever, left or right for one limb of the Basilica system. But putting them both catheters through a single access, be that transcaval, axillary, carotid, is okay. The one issue I think that many labs will have with doing that from the carotid is just ergonomics. You have to sort out the ergonomics of how you're going to, because you do need a bit of space for the guide catheters, the microcatheters, the guide wire, the connecting the bovie, and trying to do that sort of at the head without a proper ergonomic setup, without tables and all that sort of thing, can be challenging. So, I certainly wouldn't do that until you're facile with doing these procedures from the femoral. Your team and everyone is comfortable with the setup and the catheters and that sort of thing, because I think it will be challenging as initial cases.
Yeah, no, definitely. I would not do that in my first 2 cases, 5 cases, maybe even 10 cases. So I assume you've had experience with all the techniques available. Can you give us kind of a brief overview of where you think the differences are between, let's say, Basilica, Unicorn, Shortcut? Obviously, Telltale is going to be much more similar to Basilica.
So I think the way I think about it and maybe is to sort of think about techniques that do single laceration versus techniques that seek to sort of do wider disruption, intraleaflet deployment. And so I would put Basilica and Shortcut in the first bucket, and probably balloon-assisted Basilica, and then I would put, Unicorn, Cleave, Batman on the mitral, all of those intraleaflet deployment techniques in the other. And I think, the published data from Shortcut and the published data from Telltale, which is still under FDA review, it looked very good. And I think, confirm that in the right patients, a single laceration is an effective way to prevent coronary obstruction, and it's a safe approach. We obviously have no comparative data between mechanical leaflet laceration with a blade, which is the Shortcut, versus electrosurgery. Having done a lot of benchtop experiments and animal experiments in the early days of leaflet modification, I personally favored electrosurgery just because I think that RF is a better and cleaner modality for cutting a degenerated leaflet than a blade. But I think we're going to learn as a community as we go forwards whether there really is a difference. When it comes to the intraleaflet deployment, they've gained a lot of traction very quickly, and some of that is a little surprising to me, because the most difficult part of a Basilica procedure is traversing the leaflet, and you have to do that with a Unicorn as well. So I have heard people say, "Oh, I prefer Unicorn because it's easier," and a part of me says, "Well, but that's the difficult part of the procedure is exactly the same for the two approaches." So I'm not entirely sure I buy that as a reason. But some the making a flying V and that sort of thing is procedural steps I accept. But so is progressive ballooning a leaflet, the catheter exchanges to get a valve in. I think what I would say about the intraleaflet deployment, and I'm going to focus on the aortic valve because that's what we've spoken about most here, is I think that if you're going to do that, then you have to do an intraleaflet deployment, meaning you have to make a hole in the leaflet but not completely tear the leaflet, so that when you bring your valve in, which essentially means you have to use a balloon expandable as the second valve, you complete the tear of the leaflet as you expand your transcatheter valve. I know that there have been variations on this where people have just used big balloons, torn the leaflet, and then come in with either a balloon expandable or a self-expanding second. And that is attractive because it seems simpler. You don't have any issues with delivering the valve into the leaflet. But I think that is very risky as an approach, because we have no idea how that big balloon tears that leaflet. And, does it create a nice split down the middle like Basilica? Probably not. Does it follow the path of least resistance where there's no calcium in the leaflet? Probably. And it is quite possible that all you do is tear the leaflet off one of the commissural suture posts and you end up with a big flap. And then when you deploy your valve, if you're lucky, you'll trap that flap this way. If you're unlucky, you'll trap it that way, and it just occludes the coronary or prolapses into the coronary. And I have certainly seen cases of coronary obstruction or leaflet prolapse into the coronary after that approach, where people have completely torn a leaflet and then implanted a valve. So I really don't think that that is the way to do it. my bigger concern, and I'm sorry, I'm monopolizing the conversation, but my bigger concern with these newer techniques is that they have not been subjected to the same scrutiny as Basilica or Shortcut, meaning, some of them, it's literally a case report here, case on Twitter there, and people start doing it. And I think as a community, we need to be very careful that we don't do it that way. If there's a new technique which has promise, we should collectively get together, investigator initiated, prospective, collect the data, and then compare it to what the data we have on Basilica. Maybe it's better, maybe it's not, but I would hate for the field to sort of migrate to a technique that then a year or two from now we discover is causing a lot of complications. And so I think it's, Basilica was studied prospectively in an EFS, in a pivotal trial. Then we've got 2 dedicated devices, the Shortcut, the Telltale, that have been through proper prospective pivotal trials with all the adjudicated endpoints. And that's the way we should really be, developing these adjunctive techniques before everyone jumps on the latest craze.
Yeah, and I think that, I was talking to somebody recently and they said, well, all this leaflet modification is MacGyvering. I get that. I mean, there's no proctoring, there's no company to support you. The shortcut is still not available except in very select centers. So I do think that there's a real concern with that. And I think as Shortcut and hopefully Telltale become more available, maybe some of these techniques will become a lot less necessary.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that, when all you have is the off-label MacGyvering, that's what you're going to do. And I do think that we have good data to show that the Basilica, which is the off-label procedure we're talking about here, is effective and safe. But clearly with dedicated devices that cut out the bench side modification of devices. And I agree with you. I think in the future, the dedicated devices will supersede the need for off-label things.
Yeah, no, this was great. Thank you so much. I don't want to take any more of your time. We could talk for hours about this. Maybe at some point we have to do this again and talk about the mitral side. It sounds like you maybe have slightly different feelings about intraleaflet deployment on the mitral side than on the aortic side.
I think that without going into a lot of detail, I think that the mitral, as in most ways, is more complex than aortic. We're not just dealing with a single entity on the mitral. It's not, we have valve in rings, we have valve in MAC, we have all, and I think that potentially there are different approaches depending on what you're treating on the mitral side. And so I think that's why I agree with you. I think it's worth a separate conversation, and it may not just be one size fits all on the mitral.
Cool. Well, Toby, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And we'll do this again and we'll talk about mitral.
Great. Always good to chat with you, Andrei.
Thank you. Pleasure chatting with you.